Okay, at 4:30, I'm gonna call the council to order. All councils are present, except for Ben, he's on remote,
Erica will not be joining us tonight.
and Erica will be absent.
Erica will be absent,
Where's
yes.
Erica? Okay,
Yep.
let the record show that.
Call to order the Public Utilities Commission. Let the minutes note, we have a quorum with me and Jack, or Jack's over there.
Okay, please join, for the pledge of allegiance. Rise to great nations.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. Okay, I don't know, Michelle,
I can do the introductions real quick. So, appreciate everybody getting together. It's nice to get the council and the commission to meet. Lots of times we've just kind of done updates. As I think everybody's aware, we have identified some elevated PFAS levels in wells 8 and 9. The utility's been working on that for a little while now. We did receive a grant through the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to do further investigation and potentially some engineering design work if needed. As part of that, we've been working with Bolton and Mank, who are really good, really well informed on the whole PFAS issue. We actually had Bolton and Mank come and do an internal presentation to utility staff, and we invited city staff over. Again, just trying to be sharing knowledge, making sure that everybody understands what's going on. That was a really good presentation. I think we got a lot out of that, to where we thought it'd be really good for both bodies to hear the same information. So Megan and Brian are here from Bolton and Mank, and I'll just hand it over to them to let you know kind of what we're finding.
Sounds good. Thanks, Keith. So,
Need 1 second here, I forgot to do approval of the agenda.
oh, no problem.
So we need a motion to approve the agenda.
Make a motion to approve the agenda.
Second.
And motion and second, approve the agenda, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
All right, thank you. Good evening or good afternoon. So my name is Brian Golden, and I'm going to give a little introduction and kind of talk about the process here from a little bit higher level perspective on what the utility is doing to address the PFAS issue in this kind of phased approach that we're taking. And then Megan's going to do the bulk of the talking and get more into details about the PFAS. So just kind of looking at how to address the issue, right? And when there's PFAS in water, there's really two options to look at, is to either treat it or to look at an alternate water source. So from the get-go, these are the really two options in front of you. And when we first started talking to the utility about this, is we wanted to take a phased approach of this. We didn't want to jump into a certain solution without fully investigating what's all out there. And so that's what I just want to talk about first, is kind of the phased approach that's been gone through. So phase 1 is looking at data collection, review, and alternate analysis. And so when we look at the PFAS, we have to understand how significant it is, which wells is it in, and figure out what type of solution might best fit for the utility. So I'm just going to kind of step through these other items. So reviewing that existing data, both historical, and we're going to also see that we're collecting additional data as we go. The next thing was looking at optimizing the treatment plant and well 7 that did not have PFAS detections. So we looked at historical water usage and projected water usage to determine, can you sustain your system on the wells that don't have PFAS or lower concentrations? Is that a viable option? And so that is something we had to consider really on the front end. Again, continuing to sampling for collecting additional data is part of the phased approach. And then looking again at the current water demands to look at different alternatives for PFAS response. And so if it is wells or if it is treatment, what type of capacity is needed? So that was kind of phase 1, data review and collection and analysis. The next phase, and actually we're still kind of in phase 1, maybe slightly in phase 2. So phase 2 would be a well siting study. So the cheaper alternative for dealing with PFAS is going to be to find an alternate water source rather than treatment. So the question is, does that alternate water source exist? And so phase 2 would be looking at, are there other sources in and around the Princeton area that could provide water that does not have PFAS? And is there a realistic way to know whether or not that water is protected from having PFAS in the future? Right? And we're dealing with hundreds of feet below the ground surface and collecting data to try to answer these questions. And so the second part of that phased approach is really looking at, is it possible to find a water without PFAS that would serve your needs both currently and then in the future with growth? And again, currently we're kind of in phase 1, phase 2. So examining the extent of the PFAS contamination. So some of that is data collection, trying to understand where is it and where is it not and where might it be coming from. And these are things that are impossible to answer with 100% certainty. So it's really about risk mitigation. This phase approach is risk mitigation, doing the best we can with the data we can get. And then determining if a replacement well is even possible. So that would be the step phased approach, looking at an alternate water source. And then if so, where would the well go? And then eventually there would be design of the alternatives, whether that be a well or treatment. And so this is kind of the phased approach we're stepping through, and we're still stepping through it. But this is the plan that's been in place for approximately probably about a year now. And there was a grant from MPCA received for $800,000 to go through this process and even design the selected alternative whenever that gets determined as we get through these phased approaches. So I'll wrap it up there because I know we want to get into more details, but I just wanted to give you an overview of the process that's been going on and before we get into some of the details.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So we live in city limits, but we have a private well. Will, like, those of us who have a private well, or will our water be tested to see if our water is also contaminated?
So that is a great question, and it's a possibility. So that would be something up for the consideration of both the city council and the PUC of, is private sampling of wells a good idea and how should that be done? And that's something certainly that could be discussed. But right now, there's no planning for that. So I'll turn it over to Megan, but I'll be handy too to help answer questions. So.
Hi, everyone. I'm Megan Brockman with Bolton and Mink. I'm our in-house drinking water PFAS expert, so I get to be in this world all the time. Keith and Scott have heard my hours and hours of explanation on this. So usually when I give an intro to PFAS, when I do it for rural water, they give me 3 hours. That's how long it takes to get through this stuff. I'm going to get through the intro in hopefully like 5 minutes. So if you have any questions, I can go through it at the end. But it's real easy to get in the weeds with this stuff. So first of all, what is PFAS? I'm going to set this down rather than going like this. PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. You never have to say the full name, just if you're ever playing a trivia game, that's what the full name is. It's not just one compound. It's actually a group of compounds that are entirely man-made. So they do not occur in nature. This was made in a lab by a guy back in the 1930s. It was 3M and DuPont who originally started it. Now it's more people make it, but it was this synthetic chemical that was meant to serve a purpose in the manufacturing chain. As of right now, so again, they've been around for about 100 years. There's over 15,000 different formulations that fall into this group. Right now, we can test for about 30. So we've just touched the surface on these in our understanding. We've only been actively studying them roughly about 20 years. There's some reporting and again, we get into the weeds as to why there's a gap there, but we've only been looking at them for a while. So right now we can do 30, but there are a lot more. To complicate that, you can't just study one of them and call it good. They all behave completely differently. One behaves a certain way in the environment. Another one will react in a different way. One will transform into a different one. This one won't. They all just behave very different. But the things that allow us to call them one group together is one, their chemical nature, which I have a pretty molecule if anyone's curious about what the molecule looks like, but I'll skip that for now. The biggest thing was they were fire resistant and they were really good at non-stick, oil repellent, water repellent. When I say fire resistant, I've got the fire sheep here. You can heat these guys up to 1,000 degrees Celsius and they won't break down, which is 1,832 degrees Fahrenheit, if I remember my conversion correctly. That's above the melting point of steel. So it's not something that's going to happen naturally in the environment. If we had fires that hot, I think we would have a problem. Jet fuel fires don't even get that hot. In fact, actually, that was one of its biggest uses back in the day, was to put out jet fuel fires at airports. The FAA required it to be on site for that particular reason. The other is those non-stick properties. It is really good for non-stick coating, water repellent, and oil repellent. Now, any surfactant, any soap will do that too. However, your soap is going to break down in the environment pretty quickly. That's why there's an expiration date on most cosmetics. This guy won't. To kind of use a comparison, and if this freaks anyone out, I apologize, but with radioactive waste, you can put it in a barrel and bury it, and within 100, 1,000 years, whatever it is, it's less harmful. That's not what these guys do. You can bury it, put it under the ground for 100 years, come back, and to our knowledge, it'll be exactly the same. So you can't just let these guys sit. You have to do something in order to go after them. So that's my intro. Where can you find it? Just about any consumer product potentially could have PFAS in it. These have been around for a long time. They were a boon for the manufacturing industry, so they've become ubiquitous in our supply chain. Now, if you're talking especially something that's coming in from overseas, we really don't know if it has PFAS in it because they have different regulations than we do around these guys. They were voluntarily phased out in the 90s in the US, but a lot of times these are made in Asia or overseas. They're getting outlawed in the EU, so it's a little bit less there. But essentially anything, big ones are the firefighting foam, as I mentioned, anything you want to make waterproof. Non-stick pans was huge because you could keep heating it every time and it wouldn't break down. The other compounds they used would. So when we talk about trying to ban these, which there is a Minnesota law in place right now that says you can't manufacture these here, to try to tackle that problem is very difficult. And actually they're dealing with that right now. That's why if you see this case in the news, it's because manufacturers basically went, how can we figure out if this has this or not? It's everywhere. They found it in polar bear blood. They found it in ice caps. It's in 98% of human blood samples that are tested. So this is pretty much ubiquitous, which if you think about something that's been around that long and it doesn't break down, kind of makes sense. It's just going to keep spreading and accumulating and accumulating. And this is the fun one. It has been linked to toxicological problems. So cancer, organ failure, reproductive issues, immune system issues, low birth rates, you name it. They've been linked to this type of toxicological impact. Now, just to thrash it down the scariness a little bit, these are chronic impacts. So when we're talking about toxicology, sorry, just a lot of syllables. Toxicology, there's acute impacts and chronic impacts. Acute impacts is like in the movies where someone drinks a glass of water and they fall over dead. That's acute impacts. That's a high concentration, one shot, and you get whatever the impact is. Chronic is long term. In fact, the EPA and most toxicologists use 70 years as a lifetime. They assume you drink 1.5 liters a day. They assume you ate some dirt as a kid. You probably licked some paint. They account for all of that in their equations. So while this is scary and something we do need to handle, it's a long-term exposure issue. It's not an acute issue. So that's why when we found it in PPU, it wasn't an immediate like shut the water off. It's a chronic problem. So while we do want to handle it, we don't have to totally go that way. This is in the public. People know about it. I get asked about it when people find out what I do. I actually got asked about it on my honeymoon. My husband found that really funny. Really enjoyed that I brought that with me. They've been movies about it. Dark Waters with Mark Ruffalo was a big one. If you're interested in the history behind PFAS that I don't have time for it now, he goes into it, the rules around it, why it's set up the way it is. So I would recommend that one. There's also a lot of information about it, Minnesota specifically. So the Minnesota Department of Health last year, a little bit before that, started sampling at all the drinking water systems in Minnesota. They then posted those results on a publicly available website. I don't love it because they don't give context to the results. They kind of just tell you, yes, you have a concern or you don't. They don't tell you when it happened or why or anything like that. So I don't love it, but the point being, a member of the public could type in Princeton and PFAS and they would get probably directed to this website. And they would need some help sifting through what it says. I can tell you right now, I tested it with some people. It's not super clear. But we do know it's out there. Another reason that's kind of driving us talking about this, the EPA is going to start setting maximum contaminant limits for 2 PFAS compounds, PFOA and PFOS. I can say the full name if anyone wants those, but I'll save you. They're going after those 2 because they've been around the longest. They're the ones that have been used the most. They're the ones that also have the most toxicological data on them. So they're going after those first. Originally, they did have an additional 4 compounds in the rule. They have since rolled that back, but the new administration has confirmed this rule is staying in place. So after 2031, any drinking water system has to maintain a level of PFOS and PFOA below 4 nanograms per liter. Now, even those of us who work in water probably are not used to seeing nanogram per liter. To give you an idea of that concentration, that's a drop of water in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So 4 nanograms per liter is 4 drops in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. We can only detect 2 nanograms per liter. So we are just above the detection. So my golden rule I teach people is if you have a detection, you need to think about what you're going to do about it. We're just right at that level. And in fact, the EPA has what they call a goal for a limit, and their goal is 0, no presence. So these are definitely a concern. They were using something called a health index for a while. That's not a part of the rule anymore, so I won't get into that. It's a complicated equation to account for more than one being present. So that was my super quick version that I said I do. The main things I want you to worry about is this is potentially harmful. It's a public health concern. We do find it in the environment. It's a problem everywhere. It's not just a problem for Princeton. It's not just a problem for Minnesota. It's literally a global issue. And then these aren't something where we can just kind of use natural attenuation like we can with some compounds or even add a chemical or put it through a reactor. It just doesn't work with these guys. They are really, really resilient, which if you're a manufacturer is great. If you're a water engineer, it's not so great because you can throw everything at it and nothing happens. So how do we get rid of it? Essentially, the default of kill it with fire does not work with these guys. You can't just do that. So generally what we're doing is we're trying to get it out of the water when it's at such a low concentration onto something else or into something else that's easier to handle, easier to store, easier to dispose of. The 3 methods that you can use are GAC, ion exchange, and reverse osmosis. Now, if you look at these left to right, it goes left side is the easiest, right side is the hardest. So reverse osmosis is like the tricked out Mustang of treatment availability. GAC is like the steady sedan. They also go left to right and most expensive. So GAC is going to be the cheapest. RO is going to be the most expensive. When I'm talking about cost, we're a little bit in a different league than generally what we talk about. So one example, there was a Twin City suburb Brian and I were working with. They already had a nice new water treatment plant. They wanted to see what it would be if they added PFAS treatment. We just did this last year. It would have been $20 million to add GAC reactors for that community. It is larger than Princeton, but it gives you an idea of kind of the magnitude that we're talking about. And that was just to get it set up. That was not the operations, that was not training staff, that was nothing, and that was the cheapest option. So we're talking about large amounts of money when we're dealing with treatment for PFAS. So as Brian mentioned, we don't like to jump right to treatment. What we want to try first, which is much more affordable, is can we get away from it? Can we go somewhere else while MPCA and other organizations are trying to clean it up? Can we get away from it and optimize what we're doing that way? So finding a new water source. We're really lucky in Minnesota. We have a lot of options for drinking water. So this is considered a valid method. The EPA does recognize it as an action item if you have a PFAS problem. However, we can't just go out and go, okay, you need a new well, plop it right there, you're good to go. I wish my job was that easy. It's not. So the questions we're asking is, one, where is the PFAS? Because we don't want to be there. Can we figure out where it is generally? We don't get it down to the foot, but is it in this aquifer? Should we try going deeper? Should we try going shallower? Should we try going over here? And really, the next step is, okay, groundwater tends to move. That's just what it does. So you don't want to plop a new well and then in 5 years, the PFAS is just moved over there. Especially as you're pulling water in, it makes the groundwater move towards that well faster. So we want to understand, where does the groundwater move? Are we at risk of potentially having the same issue just later? And then this one's really important that I want to put into context when we're talking about PFAS. This thing is so ubiquitous and the concentration at which we're concerned are so low. You will never hear me say something is PFAS free, because you can't say that. That is not something we're able to do. What you can say is it's below the detectable limit. That's your goal. You're trying to get below the detectable limit. So just that's always my talk I have. I think I had it with Keith and Stott when we first started, where I was like, do not answer the phone and say it's PFAS free. Don't do that. That's not a thing you can say. So really what we're looking at, this isn't a case where we're going, yep, this is the one option we want. When we're dealing with PFAS, we're just trying to eliminate the bad options and looking at what's left. Certainty is really difficult when we're given this type of situation. We're just trying to lower your risk and make the best decision with what we're able to use with today's technology. So with that, I'll get into now specifically about Princeton. So these are the 3 water supply wells for Princeton Public Utilities. Well 7 is up north by Water Treatment Plant 1. 8 and 9 are right next to each other by Water Treatment Plant 2. Our problem has really been at wells 8 and 9. 7 has not, knock on wood, ever given a detection for PFOS. Based on some results we're getting, we're thinking it's unlikely, but I'll get into that here in a minute. But just so you understand, 8 and 9 are close to each other. 7 is further away. So the 2 compounds we're worried about, like I mentioned, are PFOS and PFOA. They've been in use since the 1930s, but then they were voluntarily phased out. So they're not actively making them anymore. If 3M came in and said, we want to set up a manufacturing plant here, they're not going to make PFOS. They can't. I say can't. They technically could, because it was voluntarily phased out. They hopefully wouldn't, I guess is the way to phrase that. So they could technically turn it on. However, that doesn't mean it's just going to go away. We know it doesn't naturally attenuate. So even if everyone stopped putting it in the environment altogether, it would still be present, as well as things like landfills, stockpiles exist. There's still ways for it to get in, even though it's not actively being made. But generally, this is PFOS and PFOA are those older ones. It's possible that the source of the PFOS in Princeton came as far back as the 1930s. I have no data that says that isn't what happened. One other thing that we kind of talked about before the meeting started, there's no test results that we can get that tell us where the PFOS came from, or PFOA. There's no little tag on it that says like, I came from down the street. The PFOS from one source looks exactly like PFOS from another source. So generally my recommendation is to not put your energy in trying to find where it came from, unless it's something really obvious. I was telling kind of an anecdote. This is public knowledge. City of Hastings has been trying to prove their PFAS came from a 3M plant on the eastern side of the Twin Cities. They've been doing it for about 10 years. They have spent $20 million to try to prove, and they still have not successfully done it. We thought they got there last month, and then I just talked to one of their council members, and nope, that got thrown out. So it's very, very difficult and expensive to prove. That's generally not where we want to put our limited funding and energy. We want to try to get away from it. If we can't get away from it, then you start looking at, is there some places that are better? You kind of start answering that. But first thing is to just, can we get away from it? So these are the PFOS results for PPU's drinking water. You can see they started taking testing results back in 2022. That was with the Minnesota Department of Health. And then we came in 2024 and started taking samples as well. What you'll see here is up until last year, things were pretty steady. Now the error on this test is about 1 nanogram per liter. So seeing it move between the 2 lines there, that's just kind of normal noise. I'm not too worried about that. What you see happen with well 8 there, that orange line where it takes a dip, that's because the instrument can't tell the difference between 2 and 0. So it puts it in as 0. But really you could just as well say it's 2, which means it's been relatively similar. What happened was all of a sudden the results started jumping around. Now we were turning wells on and off and adjusting the well scheme a little bit, but I work with a lot of communities that I've never seen this before, especially this quick. and this dramatic. So actually we reran the samples a couple times because we thought maybe someone had just mixed up the bottles. But no, both our results and MDH showed that it had actually switched from well 9 to well 8. That made me not concerned, but curious, I think is a better way to phrase it. And then all of a sudden, the last round we took here in April, we got no detections for either well, which at first we were like, great, it's gone. And then I was like, wait, I don't think it's actually gone. I think something's going on here. So we just took another round last week. We're going to be looking at some things. I'll get into that here, but the results have just been jumping around more than I would expect. So we actually pushed the well siting study a little quicker than we were planning on it because I wanted to understand the hydrogeology in this area because this wasn't making sense with what we know about PFAS. So this is the really crazy graph. I apologize. I'll walk you through what you need to take away from this one. So usually in other parts in the state, when you look at this graph, what this is essentially what the ground beneath your feet looks like if we were to fall down a hole and look at it sideways. It should look somewhat like a layer cake if we're in kind of traditional geology. In Princeton, it doesn't. It looks more like someone took their hand in the cake and like ripped it out. Or at least that's what it looked like to me when I was thinking about it this afternoon. Yeah. It looks like the smash cake with like the 1-year-old. That's what it looks like. So what this tells us, and actually we do see this more up on the Iron Range where they've got a little different geology. What you have is an underlying level of hard granite. You don't want to go in the granite when you're putting a well. You won't get water out of it. Above the granite, what you have is a mixture of clay and then sand and gravel. Water doesn't go through clay very well, so we don't want to stick a well in the clay layer. Now, the sand and gravel can potentially produce a lot of water. The reason is back in, who knows when, ancient times, Ice Age type thing, in the state of Minnesota, in this part, what we believe happened is if you've ever poured out like storm water or a bucket of water and seen it kind of flow over the ground in little tiny rivers that look like fingers, that's essentially what was happening on a really large scale. So those sand and gravel pockets that you see, if we were to really zoom out, they actually look like someone took their fingers and went like that across the landscape. It doesn't quite come out that clean because geology and things have shifted, but that's why you see the pockets of the sand and gravel with the clay. So right away that told me, all right, we're in a place with a little more difficult geology. So that explains a little bit why things aren't behaving the way I would expect them to. And you can see I summarized that there. The next thing we looked at is I tried to see if they were surface influenced. What that means is, can I draw a line? And this is a little difficult because my laser pointer won't show up. But what I try to do is I try to see if the pocket where a well is connected to the surface. What that means is if I were to dump out a bucket of water, if I gave it enough time, could that water travel all the way down to where my well is putting in? Because if you look at the black lines, those are all the well columns. They're cased to a certain depth, which means they don't pull in water above that line. Where you see the little cross sections, that's where it's pulling in water from. Just to give you some background. So if, for example, you see where those two little question marks are, right where it says sand and gravel, I can draw a line from the very, very top all the way down to where those wells pull in. That tells me that those wells, those happen to be 2 private wells, are potentially surface influenced. If I couldn't draw a line like that, there's a potential that they're actually semi-protected by the clay layers. So if we look at, this is wells 8 and 9, I can draw a line. It's a little difficult to see with the colors, but I can do that with 8 and 9 on our cross section. And we've got multiples of these cross sections. I wasn't going to make you look at them, but we can draw a line all the way down. That doesn't say for sure they're surface influenced because these maps aren't perfect, but it's interesting. It's more likely that it at some point could have been contaminated. So then I looked at well 7. Remember, 7 is different than 8 and 9. So right now I'm trying to see the difference. Why is 7 behaving different than 8 and 9? I can't draw a line like I could with 8 and 9. I get blocked by the clay layers. What that means is the clay might actually be protecting the pool of water that 7 is pulling out from, because the contamination can't get through the clay. Again, we don't know that absolutely for sure. We would have to do some type of tracer or another test to prove that, but it's a potential difference between them. The other thing we picked up that I don't have a pretty picture to show you, but the groundwater that's being pulled in by wells 7, 8, and 9 is what we consider younger groundwater. So groundwater could be as old as the Ice Age, or it could be as new as, like I said, that bucket of water you just turned over. We define age by when it last saw the atmosphere, because that's when it transitioned from surface water to groundwater. What happened in 1945 in the atmosphere? Yes. So we actually, there's a little bit of a delay because the atmosphere didn't immediately start showing it over everywhere. But we actually see groundwater from about the 1960s contains an element called tritium, which is a decay product of nuclear atomic energy that we see in younger groundwater. We don't see in groundwater that has been protected or not seen the atmosphere since the 1960s. What that's telling me is something is flushing out the aquifers in Princeton. Now, it's not like as fast as you're picturing with like a toilet or something like that, but it means it's being refreshed somehow. Otherwise, it would have gone dry by now. So something's going on, which is, again, just adding pieces to the puzzle. So then the next thing we looked at, another kind of crazy chart here, we looked at where the groundwater was actually coming from, but we looked at it from a planar view, like you were in a plane and you stick your head out the window. So those red lines are what we call flow paths. What they're doing is they're modeling what would happen with a drop of water traveling from where it is all the way to get into one of the wells over 10 years. So the end of each one of those lines represents 10 years of time. As you get closer to the well, you're more like 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, so-and-so years closer. So the closer you are to the well, the less time has passed. We generally don't do more than 10 years because then the data gets really messy and not very accurate. So what we saw, again, I'm trying to see the difference between 8, 9, and 7. See here. They're pulling from different areas of town and different areas of the landscape. They don't cross each other. The red lines don't cross. So that was very interesting. Usually I see them cross at least a little bit, but the way the hydrogeology is in this area, it's almost pulling straight west, or sorry, east, straight east, which is really interesting. But they're pulling from different areas. So then I looked at, all right, taking into account potentially surface influence, where it's pulling in, what land uses are around each well or in the flow paths. If you look at well 7, it's mostly pulling, there's a little bit of part of town that's covered, but it's mostly undeveloped agricultural kind of areas. For our purposes, agricultural means undeveloped because they're not, PFAS generally isn't used in the food chain. But then when I looked at 8 and 9, it goes directly through the airport, the old railway, and the industrial park. Not saying that's where it's from. I want to be very clear. I have no proof of that. But again, it's a difference between 7, 8, and 9. Now, you try to find records from a railway back in the 1930s. I dare you because I can't do it. I'm lucky if I can find a record from the 1970s. So we have no idea what was going on in town for that long. Maybe there was a spill at some point. Maybe there wasn't. Maybe it's coming from somewhere totally different. I don't know, but it's a difference between 7, 8, and 9. What this also tells me is that potentially 7 is probably not going to give me a hit like 8 and 9 are. They're pulling from different sources of water. So this made me take a deeper breath that I wasn't going to all of a sudden start seeing PFOS in well 7, which I was legitimately worried about pretty bad. So this gives us a little bit of a breather that we've at least got time. 7 should keep giving us PFOS low water. I almost said PFOS free. I broke my own rule. So the conclusions we got from this study, 7 it's different than 8 and 9. There are clear differences here where it's pulling in water from. That should be west to east. I did it again. I flipped them. But 7 and 8 and 9 are probably not going to cross each other. The issues we're having in 8 and 9 are probably not going to happen to 7. Most I'm saying probably and not for sure, but there's nothing indicating we're going to have a problem where the water that's in 8 and 9 is going to all of a sudden reach 7. The groundwater is just not flowing that way. I didn't see anything where I was immediately like, oh, that's the old 3M plant. That makes sense. I didn't see anything like that. There was nothing where it was immediately obvious. I looked at the industries in town. None of them are really something I would put on like a, we need to watch that type thing. It just isn't. Again, not saying It could or could not. I don't have that data, but nothing made my alarm bells go off in my head. The airport, usually airports we're very nervous about. Your airport is too small. If it was like MSP, I'd be like, well, it's probably our issue. But it's too small. They wouldn't have used the phones, and if they did, it would have been so rare it couldn't give you the problem that you're having. So what this long presentation that I put you through, I'm really saying is I know there's a difference between 7, 8, and 9. That's kind of as far as we've been able to prove. So the next steps that we're going to take, they're kind of the outstanding questions. We're still trying to find the extent of where the PFAS is. We know it's not in the north by 7, but I don't know what's on the eastern side of town. We didn't have any samples given that the groundwater is pulling from the west. So I don't know if there's any over there. We would have to do some of that private well or other sampling to figure that out. Could we put a well in another spot of town? Actually, over by 7, there are some old sealed wells that showed some favorable hydrogeology. Kind of just keeping that in the back of our heads, but we'll wait and see. Because I still can't answer these questions all the way, at least where I'm comfortable enough putting a well in the ground. So our next steps, the biggest one is continuing to sample. There's so much error with these tests. It's extremely difficult to do. So we want to make sure we're sampling quarterly. If you sample more than that, you start getting a lot of noise in the data. It takes about 4 weeks to run a sample. So we want to make sure we're continuing to sample. I want to see if those numbers keep jumping up and down because that's strange and that would interest me. Another thing we're doing that I didn't mention, there's actually 3 different methods to test for PFAS in water. There's method 533, which is what the Minnesota Department of Health uses. There's 537.1, which is what Bolton and Mink prefers to use because I like it better. And then there's 1633, which can be used for wastewater. It's generally what you have to use, but it also can be used for drinking water. So this last round of samples we took last year, we actually took from the same source 3 sets of samples and we ran them with the 3 separate methods. And we're going to see if there is a difference in the results you get, which would explain why MDH is getting different results than we get. I can tell you in other parts of the state, we do see that. But this is the first time we've ever tried the methods right up against each other where we're taken at the exact same moment. So I'm really curious to see, no one so far that I could find in the literature has tried that out yet. So I'm really interested to see if we see a difference, because that helped clear some stuff up. What kind of started this whole thing, and why we wanted to do an update, NPCA is starting to do some of their own investigation into PFAS contamination in the state. Don't ask me why they started now instead of like 5 years ago, but they are doing their own kind of sampling. They did some soil borings. They're doing some private well testing. They're allowed to do that. That data should be publicly available because they're the NPCA, which means we should be able to see it. However, they are allowed to take their time processing that data. I know they took some stuff. I do not know the results they got yet, but I have asked that they share that data with us as soon as they are able to, because they're actually using an outside contractor, Braun, to do that sampling, and they've said they will. So I'm hoping we get to see those results. Like Brian mentioned, we're still trying to optimize that existing water use because we want to buy time while we can. We don't want to optimize that use of 7 in water treatment plant 1, as well as just in the back of our minds, we're always thinking about those possible future expenses. Just whenever there's a new grant coming out or a potential funding opportunity, keeping our ears to the ground because Princeton would be a good candidate for that, given that you have the issue. There's 25 communities in Minnesota that are over the MCLs right now. So potentially Princeton could fall into that bucket and get a funding source for that. So we're keeping our eyes out for that. With that, if anyone has any questions, I can answer those. Hopefully I got close to the 25 minutes. Like I said,
Could you elaborate on one thing for me?
Yeah.
Again, the groundwater for 7 is different from the groundwater for 8 and 9. Not just from a PFAS perspective, but also from an iron and manganese perspective.
Mhm.
So even if we shut down 8 and 9 and tried to rely on 7, we still have a challenge in terms of treating that water as well. So that kind of gets, I think, to one of your overall points where there's no clear answer. We're just trying to mitigate risk. But I want to make sure everybody understood that, groundwater has challenges, has all sorts of challenges and all sorts of regulations beyond just this one issue.
Yeah, absolutely. You still have all those others, iron, manganese. Generally what we're seeing is people, if they try to go deeper wells, which have a less risk of contamination, then they're getting arsenic and radium, which have their own issues with trying to remove and their own health concerns. So if the solution was as easy as, well, let's just go deeper, we certainly would have looked at that. But unfortunately, depending on where we go, we either have to deal with iron and manganese, which has its own treatment issues, or we have this PFOS issue. And depending on what we do about it, one solution might be cheaper, easier than the other, and we're still doing that analysis, and probably will be for a bit now, because we want to make sure when we're ready to go and put that in place, we're making the right choice. And right now, things are too mobile. I don't feel comfortable making a pull on anything right now, until I understand why those results are jumping up and down.
Just to follow up on Megan's comment about MPCA's testing. We met over Zoom, Teams, whatever, several months ago to talk about the MPCA's testing and drilling plan. And they haven't done it yet because they needed FAA. They needed an FAA airspace permit, because part of it is gonna be on, right of way in the industrial park. So they're gonna be drilling 3 test wells, in the industrial park. And, I was told that it didn't matter what my opinion was, they got to do what they got to do, and they got to pick what they're picking, and they're statutorily authorized, but I don't particularly care for their methodology and where they selected where they're drilling, so. Anyway, so that is gonna start pretty quick.
And I do want, that reminded me of something I wanted to clarify, and I can't remember if we went over it last time or not. When I spoke to the contractor actually performing the work, they are not putting in true test wells where they pump the water. They're just doing soil borings. I don't know why they keep calling them test wells, because they're not pulling water out. They're soil borings, essentially. They're testing the soil. They're not actually testing the water. I'm not sure why
And that's,
the terminology got mixed up.
yeah,
Okay.
so.
Which I would prefer they were doing the test wells, which is why I asked about it. Again, not sure where the choice was. They weren't allowed to tell me. I did call and ask, being a little nosy, and they said they were not legally allowed to tell us. So, I'm not sure what the situation is with that.
Something I'm curious about with all the discussions. You want to be careful not to light a fire department. If we had voluntarily some private wells tested, especially in the South End, Concord, Darrell, Touch Center, didn't see how the private wells test compared to ours. Is that it would have to be voluntary, I'm sure. I see 3 people right there live pretty close together. Would that be advantageous to your work? I guess,
So-
what I'm asking.
Yeah, and I want to answer this from 2 different standpoints. One being a scientific data benefit and a legal benefit. They like me to actually say this. I'm not a lawyer. I have no legal training. The rules around PFAS and testing, who has the results, who has the right to the results, who do you tell what, whose responsibility is to clean it up, is still very murky. So I would definitely recommend you get advice, legal advice on that, from someone who's an expert in the field. And I do have people who I know do know that I could connect you with. But that's the legal side. So just putting that aside, it definitely would be valuable. One, because usually what happens is private wells are a lot more shallower than municipal wells. They don't tend to share the same aquifer. So if we sample from private wells, it's not helpful. That's actually not the case here. They do share similar aquifer types. It's not going to be the exact same pool of sand and gravel, but we could probably get similar. So it would be valuable from a scientific point, but I'm by no means saying let's go do it right now. I would want to make sure you got that legal opinion before we did that, because I don't want to get you in trouble because I'm curious about what the result.
My curiosity keeps going there.
And I think if it was voluntary, it would be different, but I would want the legal, it literally changes by the week. There are active cases right now in front of Supreme Court, the state courts. So I would want somebody who actually could read those report. I tried, but it's really difficult to read those legal reports. But that would be my only concern is I'd want to make sure we were covered legally.
Yeah, part of the complication is, and we've kind of talked about it, is municipal wells are regulated by the Minnesota Department of Health. Private wells are regulated by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So you have two different agencies that sometimes don't get along.
Rarely.
And so that's just making the whole scientific side of it more challenging.
And that's why you see kind of MDH has their response plan to PFAS, MPCA has their own plan, DNR kind of has their own plan. That's why you're getting calls from multiple different agencies. USGS, I forgot about them. They have kind of their own thing. So that's why you're getting that kind of mismatch. What we're trying to do is link all of those together and really get the best data we can to choose an alternate that's best for PPU. And so hopefully the more data we get, the more we can be sure in the alternative that we end up selecting, or knock on wood, maybe it really did go away, in which case I would want to do more study just because I'm very curious to see how we did that. But it's the data says maybe it has. I just don't know at this point. I think we're all biting our nails for this next round.
Just 800 that we burned through, Keith.
Not
Not that much.
I would say maybe 30,000.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
I was in the 30 to 50 range tops.
Yeah, well, 50.
so the vast majority of that is probably time, as well as samples are running $500 a pop. We have a locked in rate of $381 a sample. But the sampling is the expensive part. And that's my other concern. I have private well people ask me if they should test, and that's the only reason I'm not like, yeah, absolutely. That's a big chunk of change for people. And as we can testify, reading those reports is not, they don't give you a guide for how to read them. So it's
How many negative tests we gotta have, and how many positive tests? Or not negative, bull detection.
by whose standards, mine or the regulators?
That ain't this stop.
So mine, I would want probably 1.5 to 2 years before I,
Quarterly test.
before I would calm down. And even then, I would want to keep investigating for the risk that it could come back. From the regulator standpoint, I have asked, because we have a couple communities that fall in that bucket. They are considering it right now, is the last I heard.
So there are other communities that are seeing testing similar to ours, where maybe
Not quite the swing that you're seeing, but where they were over and now that we're doing testing, they are under. And we have asked MDH, our testing says we're under. What does that mean? And they said they are deciding that right now.
So how many tests do we gotta have that were detectable, and then we gotta get some?
So by the regulation, at which point you get in trouble, you need to have 1 year of quarterly, they run it by a rolling quarterly average. Your quarterly average has to be over. That's to eliminate that potential error because this testing is so prone to issues. They want to try to protect systems from putting in expensive treatment. Now, you could argue it should be 2 years, it should be 3 years. You know, you can go back and forth with that till you turn blue, but it's a year of quarterly and it's rolling. So you have to have 1 full year under the rule before they start enforcing it. Now, because the Minnesota Department of Health has taken 1 year of quarterly samples from Princeton, technically you meet that requirement and they could start enforcing the rolling average as soon as we get into 2031. But what needs to happen is MDH and EPA have to agree the sampling that the MDH did qualifies. And to my knowledge, and the last I spoke to them, they have not reached that agreement yet. That always happens with state versus federal rules. MDH and EPA have to agree that what MDH does meets what the EPA wants to do. And sometimes they don't always agree.
you referred to that other suburb that did the study and found that their mitigation costs started at 20 million and then annual cost beyond that. Has anyone in Minnesota implemented any sort of mitigation?
Oh, yeah. So if you look over in the eastern corridor of the Twin Cities, they've had a PFAS problem all the way going back to 2000. They reached a separate settlement with 3M where there's a pool of money for PFAS treatment. City of Woodbury, who's all in there? Lake Elmo. Basically, any of the eastern corridor suburbs fall into that pot. Woodbury already built their temporary GAC plant. I was a part of that. They are now building their permanent GAC plant. These take about 3 years to finish construction. Cottage Grove is actively building theirs. And then the other communities, they're trying to get the funding sorted out, and then they'll go and they'll take their steps. So, but people already have the systems in place. And actually, we've been using GAC, ion exchange, and RO in treatment plants to solve other issues for a while now. So not specifically for PFAS, but their GAC is really good for taste and odor issues. Ion exchange softens water. RO does just about everything. That's your hammer for water treatment.
And by way of context, what was Woodbury's PFAS levels? Were they in the hundreds?
Yes, they had a big, and that's why that eastern corridor was a separate settlement. They were the ones who really had the first issue because it was so high we could test to that level back then is part of it. And so they actually were not able to get away from it. I think they had 22 wells at one point. 19 of them were over. So there was no way. I mean, they had to put in treatment. They didn't even waste the time trying to get away from it. There was no way. I think they did a couple exploratory bores, but they had to.
I'm not right in saying that they were at hundreds of
Yeah, they were high.
We're at 4.
Correct.
Just for context.
And if you were at 100, we might be having a different conversation
Yeah.
because I don't know that we could get away from. I would need to do a lot more aggressive exploratory, but because you're at 4, something tells me. Well, and it's interesting because even across the state, if you move even like the one city over, you get different results. That's the biggest challenge with PFAS is we've been studying them in the lab. So I started in research 15 years ago, and we thought we had a general idea of it, and then the toxicological data came out and they started looking at it a lot closer. They don't behave in the lab the way they do in the environment, which means we have to test them in the environment, which takes a lot longer. And so new studies are coming out, I mean, almost daily. And unfortunately, you have to do each compound individually for those results to be valid. So the conversation we're going to have even 10 years from now is going to be very different. But the issue is this stuff is out there now. We know about it. We know these potential toxicological impacts. So the EPA is putting the regulation in place now.
But even there, I mean, you referenced the movie Dark Water. If I remember that correctly, they were talking about thousands.
That one was, yes, they were right outside of a plant.
Yeah.
There was worker exposure.
And so when you're dealing with a chronic, to me, it seems like that would be heavily dependent on the concentration.
It is.
As well. So again, it seems like to me, what I get a little frustrated with, confused with is it seems like it's yes or no. When really, I think there's this scale and, really focusing on the higher concentration areas seems to make the most sense as we work our way down. And we would be at the, again, we're just over. So it's not like we're a Woodbury or that other.
And that is why you have not seen us pushing you to put a project on the PPL or something like that. You're gonna be on the lower end for potential funding for this. In fact, there is no specific pot of money for PFAS treatment right now. Believe me, I have complained about this. You have to go through the normal PFA funding process, the Clean Water Fund, the Drinking Water Fund. Those funds are notoriously, there's never enough money. You add PFAS in there where each project is $20+ million, that money is going to go really fast. And unfortunately, there are communities that are in worse shape. They're going to get it first before Princeton would. So you're high enough where you're an issue, and thankfully we qualified for that grant, but you're not high enough where MDH is, fighting that we need to do something about this, blah, blah, blah. So that's why it's usually 3 hours I spent talking about this. You have to put it in context.
Anybody else have anything?
So we're just in test, we're
I'm sorry?
just in test mode for a while, yeah.
Yeah, that's, we met, I believe that was a couple months ago and kind of presented what we had and everyone agreed with just how much they were bouncing around. I'd like to get at least one, maybe 2 rounds of testing, especially this comparing the methods before we start thinking about the next step. We have time before we have to spend that money, so let's make sure we're choosing the correct option to use it.
And that time is 2031.
So the regulation goes into place at 2031. I believe you have to have the money spent by 2028, but I would have to double check that.
And to meet the MCL is, to meet the MCL, we're going back to
2031. So you have till 2031 before someone starts knocking on your door saying you're in violation. You have till 2028, I believe, but I will double check to spend the money.
I think that's the thing to look at too, to the credit to the commission is, we got on this right away. We didn't lag with this at all. It was very good. First came up and they were on it like right now. Or it's part or it's or so. So,
No, that was all Scott. I mean,
okay.
he was on top
Oh,
of it.
what is that, make the public can't come to us and say, you're dragging, you don't care, or whatever, that's not, we're on it.
and there was some, and the original first round of testing was a voluntary testing that some cities didn't start testing till this year. Was it?
Yes, I believe they picked up the ones that didn't volunteer this year. Because then the EPA rule came out that said you have to test. When I was giving this talk this time last year, you didn't have to test. It was all voluntary, and so you had to have that conversation of, well, do you wanna open the box or do you not wanna open the box? And to PPU's credit, they were very much, we want to know so we can provide clean water to the residents, so. Which I'm more than happy to come in, so it's been fun.
Did anybody else get anything? I think we covered it pretty thoroughly, I guess.
Thank you.
Awesome, thank you so much, we really appreciate it.
Well, we can make a motion, adjourn.
I make a motion to adjourn the utilities commission.